Maia. Thank you for joining us on He Whare Moewai. Could you please introduce yourself and what you'd like to discuss today?
Kia ora hana, ko Maia Ratana tēnei, hiuri ahau no Te Aroa, no Taranaki o Ngāti Raukawa ki te Tonga. My name is Maia. I actually currently live in Whangarei, in Ngunguru actually, but I come from Rotorua, born and bred in Rotorua, and have lived in Auckland for about 15 years in between. Yeah. Anything else? I'm currently a lecturer of architecture at Unitec and AUT, and I also am a researcher at Ngā Waia Te Tui.
Could you please share about your journey in your tiny home and what made you want to choose living in a tiny house?
Yeah, so my whānau and I are currently living in a tiny house that we built, my partner and my 3-year-old son. I think for me it's been a long kind of journey of figuring out what housing is and what it means to me. Started off, obviously grew up in Rotorua and grew up in a whānau home on whānau land with a kind of big extended whānau, lots of coming and going. Moved to the city at 18, lived in student housing first, went to the University of Auckland, actually studied music, randomly, but studied music for a year. I think I went back and forth home as things sort of progressed, but also I did a lot of flatting for quite a few years. Rented, I think there's a difference to me between flatting and renting, but you know, once I lived with my sister and her partner and my partner, and we rented for a while, so sort of a flatting situation, but kind of more of a whānau flatting situation. We then bought our own home in Auckland, so lived in that house for a couple of years, and then we sold that house, moved into military housing, so lived in military housing for a while. Then decided it was time to leave the city during COVID, and wanted to be closer to whānau, and bought a bit of land and built a tiny house. Although the land and the tiny house are not in the same place, but that's another story.
Right.
So yeah, it's been a long journey of figuring out how we ended up in tiny living.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about how that even came about, how your tiny house progressed? I know with your background in architecture, you had a hand in designing the spaces. Do you want to share more about that?
Yeah, I think actually during COVID, we really noticed how little of our house we actually used between the three of us. When we sold our house in Auckland, we had planned on buying another house, either in Rotorua or up north. And that ended up being harder than we thought. The market kind of went crazy just after we'd sold. COVID hit, and even though we had the money, the market was really competitive, and we kept missing out. So we'd always for a couple of years, both of us had been quite interested in this idea of tiny houses. We're both quite small people, and so we didn't need a lot of space. We realised, during COVID that we only really used the garage because did a lot of crafty things. The kitchen, our bedroom, we only used one of 3 bathrooms. We didn't need 3 bathrooms. And so unless we had lots of whānau coming to stay, which we often did living in Auckland, we didn't really use half the house. And so we started looking at how we could design a small space for us to live in that was going to be closer to whānau, but could still, offer options to be able to manaaki, host people regardless of having a smaller space. So I designed the house. We took it to a tiny house builder, asked them to build it for us. So they built the shell. And so they built it, kind of the outside's all done, and then it was all lined on the inside, and electricity and all that. And then we've sort of spent the last 6 months finishing off all the interior stuff ourselves. Yeah.
So do you want to share how you felt about designing your own space? Because I know that you go into architecture school thinking that you can design your own place. That is the dream goal. And now that you've left uni and you've finished all your degrees and your masters, and then you get to finally design your own space, how does that feel?
It was like pretty exciting at first, and obviously being a smaller space, we thought, oh well, it's only small, it's not going to cost us like what it would cost to build a full-blown house. So we could sort of splash out on little things, you know, tiling and making it look pretty. We also didn't have to worry about consents or anything like that because it's on wheels. It's technically classified as a caravan, so we've insured it as a caravan. But you know, it's bigger than a caravan. So we didn't have to worry about all that kind of stuff. We could just design and build it and move it onto site and not have to worry about asking for any kinds of permission. So yeah, I really enjoyed the design process. I've always really enjoyed designing small spaces. I never really enjoyed when we had to do, you know, skyscrapers and big, like wide span buildings and stuff like that. It never really interested me. I always enjoyed residential, and I always enjoyed small residential. And you know, with a tiny house, you've got to use every little bit of space, like for storage, or so all of our, like our stairs have all got drawers in them. So all our, you know, the stairs themselves are storage. So that's where we put all our shoes and things like that. And, you know, our bathroom's compact, but it's got everything we need. The height, I guess the size of it is, it's 9 meters by 2.8 by 4.2 high. So it's not technically a full 2 stories, but you can stand up upstairs. So I really wanted it to feel like a normal house, a home, without it being huge. Yeah.
So I know you mentioned that you work in Auckland and you live up in Ngongaru and your family's down in Rotorua and your in-laws are up in Ngongaru. So do you want to share how you commute between the different cities?
Yeah, it's not easy, but for us, obviously during lockdown, we'd been in Auckland for sort of 15 years and we were ready to be closer to whānau. My sister had twins during the night we went into lockdown, and I was all packed ready to go see her. And then we went into lockdown and I was like, it's fine, it'll only be like a week or two. And then like 4.5 months later, finally got to meet her twins. And so, you know, all those kinds of compounding things. My partner had been in the military for 15 years at that stage and was ready for something new. And yeah, for us though, you know, tiny house living gave us the option to go down to one income, and to move away from, you know, the city. I don't think we'd be able to do what we're doing without our current living situation, where our house is essentially in the backyard of my in-laws, which is that's interesting too. So we're kind of living intergenerationally, but we have our own spaces. But you know, it means our expenses are really low. We don't owe anything on our house. We have a small mortgage on the land that we own, and so it gave us the flexibility to drop down to one income, despite how expensive everything is. Like, I think if we'd gone into a normal rental or tried to buy another house, we wouldn't have been able to cut down to one income. And in saying that, my partner's starting a business, so it's not like he's not working, he's just starting a business, and that takes time. So it gave us that flexibility. I remember when we owned our house, I remember getting to a point where we were like, cool, we own a house now. Now what? Like, what do we do now? And feeling quite, as great as it was, like feeling quite trapped in our jobs because we needed to keep our jobs to be able to pay the mortgage. And so, yeah, the whole tiny house thing, it gives us the option to actually go, oh, I don't know if this is working for us, actually, we might do this. And, you know, and having to swap the kind of share more equally the kind of caregiving roles with our son and that kind of stuff.
Could you tell us more about the highlights and the challenges that you find living in your tiny house, and even just compare it to how you were a homeowner?
Yeah, I think I kind of touched on it, but you know, for us, we bought our house when I think we were like 26, 27 in Auckland. It was still quite expensive, but not, you know, it was before things went really crazy. And, you know, we thought that was the kind of be all and end all. If you can buy a house, then that's amazing, and you have housing security. And a lot of my work that I do now, a lot of my research is around what is this idea of housing security, and we kind of associate housing security with home ownership, and I really want to challenge that idea that home ownership is the only way that you can achieve housing security. And we do own our house, don't get me wrong, we do, but it also gives us the flexibility to move. So we kind of have both, where we've got our home, we've got a roof over our heads. No matter what happens, we have a roof over our heads. It's a small roof, but it has everything we need. But if we wanted to move, I would quite like to move back to Rotorua in the next few years, we can literally just kind of pick our house up and move it down to Rotorua, and, not having to really worry about those kinds of things. So, there's security in knowing we have a roof over our heads no matter what. We have a whare, it's got everything we need, but we still have that flexibility of being able to be kind of transient if we want to. Mm-hmm. And I am that kind of person. I quite like to try new things all the time, and I'm not really one for just staying in one place.
So is that your next steps, to take your tiny whare once it's fully completed, and then drive it all the way down to Rotorua on your land that you've purchased with your partner, and you guys are just going to stay there?
Maybe. I'd like to. For me, it's beautiful living up north, and that's where my partner's from. But I think after being in the city for a long, however long, I'm starting to feel that pull to go back home, and be closer to my siblings and get involved in Rotorua and Te Aroa, and the things that are happening there. There's some really exciting things happening there in the housing space, and so I do feel pulled to go down there at some point soon and take our house with us and put it on our land, and maybe eventually build something slightly bigger on that land. But there's no reason why we can't just stay living in our house while it's still working for us. I think as my son gets a bit older, we will outgrow it. Yeah. At the moment he's only 3, and it's perfect. It works fine for us, and he's got his own space and we've got our own space, and that's cool. But I think as he gets a bit older, maybe 5, once he's sort of 8, 9, we might feel that we need a bit more space. Right. Yeah. So, and that's, we don't know that yet, but I have a feeling that might happen, and then we might have to look at other options. But there's also things we could add on to our house. You can add pods on, you can do things. Oh, cool. Yeah, you don't have to, we could add a room. We don't, and see what that works like. But yeah, we'll just.
So you've owned a home, you now designed your own home and built your own, and you've also purchased land. Do you want to talk about how that process came about, purchasing land in Rotorua first?
Yeah, that was kind of an accident. Sounds silly. I think talking about how we bought our home in the first place, I think we weren't really planning to. We were quite lucky in that my partner was in the Air Force, and they had a scheme that was similar to KiwiSaver, but had quite a lot more than in KiwiSaver, it accumulated faster. Yeah. So we had quite a decent deposit. And so we just kind of were let's just try and see what happens, see if we can buy a house. And to be fair, it was really hard. And I think, we didn't know what we were doing. Most banks turned us away, so we didn't have enough money. I think being young and Māori didn't help. There's kind of that, we definitely came against people who just assumed that there was no way we could service a mortgage, being young and Māori. We were young, we didn't really know what we were doing. Luckily my partner was in the Air Force, and they had a scheme that was similar, a superannuation. So it used to be that when you got out, you got paid out. I think people kind of know about that idea. But what they did, they changed it so that you could use it for your first home as well, because that's what they had instead of KiwiSaver. And so luckily he had quite a bit of money sort of sitting in as a superannuation. We were able to take that out. But regardless of that, we hit lots of barriers, lots of people who didn't believe that a young Māori couple could take on a mortgage and service a mortgage. we basically just kept getting told no all the time, and I was just really persistent and was like, no, we can do this. Didn't know if we could, but I was just really persistent. In the end, we got a broker who was really good, and we managed to find a home. It wasn't, I remember when we went to this house and my partner was like, yes, this is a great house. And I was like, no, it faces south. And so like at architecture school, like number one thing is you always design buildings to face north. Like houses always face north because that's where the sun is. Mm-hmm. And so we like looking at this house, like it was, 1960s, weatherboard, timber floor house, nice and, solid as. But I had this big thing about it facing south, and I was just like, no, we can't get it. Faces south. And he convinced me, no, it's a good house. And so we bought it. There were things like it was on a cross lease, so we didn't know what that was, and we had to look into what that meant. And so there were lots of things we didn't really understand. But, we did it. And then I think we actually didn't live in it for that long. And part of it was I had my son, and we had to buy a house that was sort of further away from all our friends because we couldn't afford to buy a house in the area they were living. We weren't really close to shops and things like that. And so when I was stuck at home, my partner, being in the Air Force, was away overseas quite often, and it was just me and this baby and no friends and no family and things like that. And it made me question, this idea of home ownership, of being like, yes, this is the goal, this is the end goal, is to live in this house that you own. But the only house we could afford was away from all my connections and all my support systems. And so I wasn't actually that happy in this house. And my partner, we were having to work really hard to pay this mortgage on a house we didn't actually really enjoy living in that much, but we were doing the thing that we were supposed to do. We'd ticked all the boxes, and we were homeowners and in our 20s, and it was all, yes, you're doing the right thing, but we actually didn't really enjoy it. And so it made us question, was this actually what we wanted for ourselves? And so we sold it, and we looked at buying elsewhere, as I mentioned, and that didn't really work out. We lived in military housing in the meantime, which was great because it was super cheap, and that was great. That was really, really good, and it gave us a real step up by having a place to live that was cheap. And in the meantime, we designed and built our tiny. Yeah, bought some land, which actually we bought with my parents. So my parents had sold their house, our homestead. They had sold their house to my sister, and so they had some cash. But they live in a bus, and they kind of do random jobs, but they don't have like solid jobs. So they couldn't service a mortgage. Like the bank wouldn't give them a mortgage because they live in a bus. And so we didn't have the cash because all our cash was going into our tiny house, but we could get a mortgage. And so they put their cash in, we serviced a mortgage, and we bought some land together. And yeah, so the idea is, we'll bring our tiny, they'll park up their bus, and that's the future.
That's a really interesting story of all the different ways that you've been living. Do you want to share some of the challenges that you've come across by trying to find land in Rotorua? I know you mentioned that you struggled to try and find family land and you just couldn't.
Yeah, I did it. We were looking for a house down there at first, and we just kept missing out. It wasn't even because we didn't have enough money. We just kept missing out for various reasons. I then started to look into whether we could get a hold of some family, like whānau land, whakapapa land. That was way too complicated, and so we just gave up on that idea. And then during lockdown, we saw this kind of section come up, and Mum had sort of said, "Oh, look, there's a section," and it's kind of, we would whakapapa to that land way back when, but it's freehold and it was on the open market. And so, yeah, like I didn't see the twins, we didn't see the land until after lockdown as well. So we never saw the land. We just bought it during lockdown, and we kind of bought it on accident. We thought we were just sort of we put it in an offer thinking, oh yeah, whatever. And then they're like, yeah, it's yours. And we're like, oh, okay. And so we bought this land. And it's quite interesting though, it has heaps of covenants on it. And for those who don't know what covenants are, they're like kind of rules around what you can and cannot build. And they're actually the developer decides what those covenants are. So it's kind of a tricky thing, because it's like, it's not actually like the council, it's the developer who decides these covenants. And so the land was actually, it was subdivided in 2007. So they're old covenants, and they're like ridiculous. Like there's things like, we have to have an internal double garage, and the house has to be no less than 125 square meters, and it has to be of certain materials, and all these different things, like crazy. And I think covenants is just weird, because like as an architect, or someone who studied architecture should portray your personality. And so when you've got all these covenants, you can't, this is how they end up having a whole bunch of like GJ Gardners or brick and tile houses in one development, because they put a whole lot of covenants that basically point to a brick and tile 4-bedroom double garage house, and so that's what people build. But it doesn't allow you to be very creative in your housing design. You can obviously get around those things, and and so one of the things is you can't have temporary housing on it, so we technically can't even put our tiny house on it. But I'm just going to be like, what are you going to do? I'm just going to do it anyway. But and so that was kind of interesting. We kind of found that out afterwards, and we were like, oh, well, I guess we just roll with it. And at the moment, it's just kind of sitting there, and we're paying a small mortgage on it. And I have kind of plans in my head of what we will do with it. If we don't stay living in the tiny house, I've got this idea of, if we've got to meet these covenants, then we just build a big shed and then just have a little house attached. So then we're meeting the double garage and the 125 square meter rule. And in my head, it's kind of like a big barn kind of thing. So I do have ideas of what we'd like to do. And actually then my mum was like, oh, well, can you add a little whare for us to live in? So now it's got this little granny flat attached to it. And so we're kind of now exploring this idea of what an intergenerational whare, a designed intergenerational whare might look like. That's also a workspace, because we both predominantly work from home. And so that's really exciting. And I don't know if we'll ever be able to afford to do it, but, got to have goals.
Yeah. So would you say you're a lot more happier now?
Yeah, I think it's nice. It's nice to live in a nice space. It's nice to live in a space that I designed. It's what I liked about a small house too, is it's super low maintenance. So takes you 15 minutes to clean. I used to hate, in the weekends having to clean 3 bathrooms and all these big rooms before you could go off and do anything on a Saturday morning. Now our house is super low maintenance, really easy to look after, which allows us to go out and do things, we don't have to worry about the house. We can just go off and enjoy Ngunguru. We live in one of the, this beautiful place with beaches all up and down the coast that we get to go and explore, and that's pretty cool. Obviously I'm still working in Auckland, and so that's quite difficult. But I'm slowly, working out how to not have to travel quite so much. And that's fine.
And how do you manage the relationships between now living with your in-laws, but they're also helpful with looking after baby while you have to work in Tāmaki as well, right?
Yeah, they are. So, the whole point was really to be closer to whānau. We realised during lockdown we had no whānau in Auckland, and actually that was kind of dumb. So even when they started to, the rules started to kind of get less strict and people could meet with their families and whatnot, we were like, oh, we don't have any, that's dumb. And so we felt really, really isolated. It was like, well, we may as well live in Australia or something if we're, can't even go see our whānau. And so that was a big part of it, was living closer to whānau. And so that's been really cool. We have our own spaces, but they're there, and they pick Son up from Kohanga every day, which is awesome because it's like a 40-minute drive. So having them being able to pick him up on the way home is really cool because they both work in town. We eat together, partly because our kitchen's not finished, but we do. I think we might actually carry it on. There's no reason why we we should cook 2 separate meals. Like, it just kind of seems a bit silly. Yeah, and just things like that. Like, it's nice having them there, but then we've also got our own spaces. I think that's the clincher of like, yeah, we all live together, but we can retreat to our own places at the end of the day and do our own thing. Yeah, but it has been different going from sort of living independently for however many years to suddenly having to kind of negotiate space. It's interesting.
Yeah, so I was just going to ask about some tips and tricks for either home ownership or trying to get into tiny whare. Could you share some tips and tricks with everyone else that would likely be interested in trying it out?
Yeah, I'm a big advocate for being innovative, and actually, you know, the way that we're going and the way that, you know, with climate change and the cost of everything, we actually have to start thinking differently about how we live. And, you know, like a big house isn't necessarily the answer, and, you know, the carbon footprint that building all these developments have. In our little whare, you know, we don't have a huge footprint. We have a composting toilet, so we don't have black water. All our grey water gets kind of just filtrated into the whenua, but, you know, we just make sure we don't use any harsh chemicals. We only use eco products, stuff like that. So essentially our footprint's a lot less. And I think going forward, we have to start thinking a bit more like that, like how we're impacting the world and the whenua and things like that, how we're having a smaller footprint. And I think, you know, policy and legislation actually has to start allowing us to do that. At the moment, we get away with it because there's no regulations, but there's nothing to say that in the coming years, as tiny houses and alternative kind of ways of living become more popular, that they won't start regulating and legislating how, you know, having to get consents and things like that. But I think they do need to allow us to think differently about how we want to live and how we want to live intergenerationally and how we want to live smaller and how we want to be able to grow our own kai and how we how we affect the environment. So I think that's inevitable. We just have to actually think differently about how we build. Yeah. I don't know, they didn't really give you any tips and tricks, but I think, you know, if you want to do the thing with tiny houses too is there isn't a loan scheme. There's sort of loan schemes that you can get, but obviously you can't get a mortgage because there's no land attached. So we were able to do it because we had cash from the sale of our house. But yeah, I think there needs to be, I actually think there needs to be more support for those kinds of housing models to be able to house our whānau. Yeah.
Do you think tiny houses could work in Tāmaki, or would you prefer it outside of Tāmaki?
No, absolutely. They're becoming so popular. Like, the people that built ours are just like smashing them out. Like, they've done something like 200 tiny houses now in the last like 4 or 5 years. And a lot of them are in Tāmaki, like kind of sort of more rural like ish, but that's because, you know, you can kind of, there's space. Like, a lot of, you know, urban houses don't have space to host a tiny house. But there's definitely examples of it, and I think it's a great option for people who feel that would be something that would work for them. Obviously it doesn't work for everybody. No, it's not for everyone, and that's totally fine. But yeah, I think it could totally work in the cities and proven to, yeah.
Yeah, so what are your aspirations for rangatahi?
Whew. Yeah, I think my aspirations is that there's more options, and that rangatahi can find housing security. And as I've mentioned, that doesn't necessarily look like home ownership. I think we need to think outside of home ownership and how we ensure housing security. I mean, there's models all over the world about how renting can be much more secure, where you have longer tenures and you're able to create a home within your, you know, at the moment there's like in Aotearoa, there's so many rules and regulations around what you can and cannot do in your rental property, and there's very little control. You know, things like 3-month inspections are very what's the word I'm looking for? But, you know, you don't have, as soon as that 3 months comes up, you realise that every time that 3 months comes up, you remember that it's not your home, it's someone else's. You're constantly reminded that this is not yours, this belongs to someone else. And so, you know, there's things like that, like not having so many inspections, and for people to be able to create a home within their rental properties. Cost obviously is a massive factor. But I think we need to ensure that housing security becomes more valued, and that we're not so focused on money, that cost isn't always the thing, and that housing shouldn't be about money. It's a human right. You know, everyone should be able to have shelter and have a roof over their heads no matter what. And so we need to just change our attitudes towards housing to ensure that rangatahi can have a home that is a home regardless of the tenure. Doesn't matter what the tenure is, they should be able to feel home and feel secure. Because when you feel secure at home, it allows you to go out into the world and be better and do things, because you're not worrying about making sure you've got a roof over your head and that you can pay the bills, and that your tenancy is not going to run out and they're going to tell you have to move. Those things, you know, when you've only got a house for a year, that's a really short amount of time.
Yes.
And so if we can change those kinds of things, then people can thrive because they're not worrying about their home life.
Thanks again, Maia, for joining us on He Whare Mōwai. Your talk has been honestly inspirational and very aspirational for anyone that's trying to do alternative living, really, trying to get by. So yeah, thank you again.
We hope you enjoyed that episode. Just a disclaimer from us. We are no housing experts. However, we are passionate about supporting rangatahi to secure safe, adequate and healthy homes.